Help me. The truth is, my parents.
Yesterday, I was rushed to the hospital after being hit by a car driven by my mother-in-law, Natalie. After the surgery, while I was resting, my husband, Steve, called.
After you were taken to the hospital yesterday, the police came. I told them you fell because you were startled by the car. But today, my mom admitted she hit you with the car.
Summarizing Steve's excited words, it seems that both of his parents were taken to the police station. I clearly remember that I was hit by the car Natalie was driving yesterday. And yet, both Natalie and my father-in-law, Robert, who was sitting in the passenger seat, gave false statements. Apparently, Steve instructed them to get their stories straight and claimed that I tripped and got injured. I was so stunned that I was speechless for a while.
Hey, are you even listening? Anyway, you need to go explain to them yourself that it was just a fall.
That's the first thing you say to me after I was rushed to the hospital. My anger boiled over, and I resolved to get revenge on my husband, Steve, and his parents. They still think I'm the compliant wife who always goes along with their plans, but that's about to change. And then, an idea struck me. This is it. I can prove that Natalie hit me with the car. Ignoring the pain in my body, I reached for my phone again. My name is Emily Thompson. I'm 50 years old. I've been a stay-at-home wife since I got married. I met my husband, Steve, when I was in my 20s. It was an ordinary office romance. Steve was assigned to mentor me when I joined the company as a new hire. Steve wasn't particularly attractive or charming even back then. Naturally, I never had any romantic feelings for him. I never once thought of him as a man, and I simply worked hard to follow his instructions every day. But after working together for a while, I noticed that Steve seemed extremely fond of me. At first, I assumed it was because he was excited to have a younger colleague close to his age, but over time, I began to sense there was more to it than that. Even though I wasn't interested at first, being flattered every day started to feel good. Looking back, I still can't figure out what I saw in him. But somehow, I fell for his sweet talk, and before I knew it, we started dating. We continued working together for a while, but after about a year, he proposed to me. Since I had no real reason to refuse, I accepted Steve's proposal. I convinced myself that this was just how life worked, and I embarked on a new chapter of my life. Following Steve's wishes, I quit my job and, without much choice, moved in with his family. I had visited his parents' house a few times after we got married, but I never imagined I'd end up living with them. When I visited before, both of them greeted me warmly, and I thought there was nothing to worry about. At that point, Robert had already retired, so during the day, it was just me and his parents while Steve was at work. There was no such thing as a sweet honeymoon phase. Married life was nothing like what I had imagined. At first, they showed a little concern for me, but over time, the way they looked at me changed. Natalie's demands grew day by day, and the stress slowly crushed my spirit.
You're lucky to be a stay-at-home wife thanks to Steve. You should at least manage to keep the house spotless, right?
Every time something didn't go her way, Natalie would gleefully criticize me. She saw it as her life's mission to educate her incompetent daughter-in-law. She often told me stories about how she had lived with her own mother-in-law, beginning with the phrase, "Back in my day." I heard those same old stories so many times that I grew sick of them. Times have changed, and so have people's values. Being forced to live by outdated expectations was nothing but a burden. Yet, because of my position, I had no choice but to listen quietly to her nagging. Natalie would often meet up with her friends for coffee, and apparently, they'd spend their time talking trash about their daughters-in-law. Oddly enough, instead of bragging about how great their daughters-in-law were, they'd boast about how incompetent they were. Whenever I heard about this, I wondered if I'd end up like them someday, and the thought filled me with dread. As for Robert, he wasn't exactly on my side either. While he wasn't as hostile as Natalie, he never missed a chance to complain about my cooking.
Today's seasoning is really strong. Are you trying to feed me unhealthy food so I'll kick the bucket early?
He had the air of an old-fashioned man who still looked down on women. He'd often say things like, "This is how women should behave. Women should anticipate what men need, or notice things before being told." Hearing his outdated ideals made me cringe. No matter how old he gets, he still clings to his past beliefs and acts all high and mighty. Robert wasn't bullying me exactly, he just enjoyed boasting about his views to me as if they were something to be proud of. He would probably never realize how wrong he was, and would just keep getting older with that same attitude. In this way, he and Natalie were like picture-perfect villains straight out of a TV drama. I tried talking to Steve about his parents multiple times, but his responses were always vague. As time passed, instead of taking my side, he began blaming me for bringing it up.
They are old, Emily. You should try being kinder. That's what being a good wife means, right?
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Just like his parents, Steve started to look down on me and boss me around. Even when he came home, he would just sit around as if it were normal, and never lift a finger to help. Maybe things would have been different if we'd had kids, but I couldn't have children with Steve. I underwent fertility treatments through my late 30s, but in the end, that dream never came true. From the moment we got married, his parents would pressure me every day with comments like, "When are we going to see our grandchild's face?" It wasn't all my fault. Having kids isn't something you can force. Having children just to please my in-laws, that idea was absurd to me. By the time I turned 40, I decided to give up on having kids. Even though my life wasn't what you'd call happy, there were people who supported me. One of them was our neighbors, the Smiths. The Smiths are a couple named Kevin and Julia, lived across the street. They didn't have kids either. Kevin's mother had struggled when living with her in-laws, so he had sworn not to burden his wife in the same way, and refused to live with his parents. Julia had been there for me when I struggled with infertility, and she would patiently listen to my complaints about my in-laws. Since Steve and his parents had good public personas, Julia was surprised at first.
I really thought your husband was a good guy, but at his age, still being so dependent on his parents, honestly, that's a bit of a turn-off.
Thanks to Julia, I was able to get through life without falling into despair. Natalie was over 75 years old, yet she still drove herself whenever she went out. Watching her drive was nerve-wracking, so I repeatedly warned Steve about it, but he wouldn't listen. When I suggested that maybe it was time for Natalie to give up her license, he'd snap, "Are you making fun of my mom?" He'd get furious, thinking I was insulting her. Even when I gently brought it up with Natalie, she acted as if she were still in her prime.
Are you treating me like an old lady? You're such an awful person.
She'd get just as angry as Steve. I always feared that something bad would happen someday, and that day came in an unexpected way. That day, I went grocery shopping at the local supermarket, just like always. Since I didn't have a driver's license, I usually walked everywhere. I had planned to get my driver's license after getting a job, but I ended up getting married much earlier than expected. When I asked Steve about it, he said, "I'll do all the driving, so you don't need one," and opposed me getting a license. On sale days, I'd always have way too many bags to carry, but there was no way I could ask Steve or Natalie to drive me. Steve, who used to happily give me a ride when we were younger, now responds with an irritated scoff. I had just returned to the front of the house, carrying bags in both hands, when I noticed the garage door was open. Did Natalie say she was going out today? Natalie hadn't mentioned anything when I left the house. Oh well, I thought, and began walking past the garage toward the front door. Just then, a loud engine roared as a car shot out of the garage at full speed. That silly sound escaped from my mouth in shock. The next moment, the car slammed into me without slowing down. The impact sent me flying backward, and the groceries spilled out of my shopping bags. I hit the asphalt hard. While trying to process what had happened, I felt a searing pain in the back of my head where it had struck the ground. My body wouldn't respond when I tried to get up, so all I could do was stare up at the sky. I don't know how much time passed, but when I became aware again, Julia was leaning over me.
"Stay with me. I've called an ambulance. It's going to be okay."
Her pale, tense face hovered above me as she shouted encouragement. Is it really that bad? That naive thought flashed through my mind. When I shifted my head slightly, I saw blood trickling down from it. Seeing that, I gradually started to understand the situation I was in. I began to realize the seriousness of the situation. But there was nothing I could do, trapped in a body that wouldn't move. As I lay there, I could hear the approaching sound of ambulance sirens.
"Hang on, they're almost here. Just a bit longer."
Julia's desperate encouragement reached my ears, but my vision started to blur.
No, just a little more."
Despite Julia's words, my eyes slowly closed. When I opened them again, I was lying on a hospital bed. An IV line was attached to my hand, with fluid steadily dripping in. I realized I was alive, and tears began streaming down my face. When I shifted my head even slightly, a sharp pain shot through it. After all that blood loss, it wasn't surprising that it hurt. Og. As I groaned on the bed, a nurse rushed over in a panic.
Don't move your head yet.
There were so many questions I wanted to ask, but I stayed quiet and listened to the nurse's explanation. According to the explanation, a whole day had passed since the accident. The paramedics, alerted by Julia's call, had rushed me to the hospital. Once I was admitted, I underwent a procedure to stitch up my head and was saved. Julia had stayed by my side the whole time, but since visiting hours had ended, she had returned home. Apparently, she had also contacted Steve, but after hearing that the surgery was successful, he didn't say much else. My whole body ached, but my life wasn't in danger. I just needed to rest for a while. Even so, I didn't feel like doing anything at the moment. I had a lot to think about, but I closed my eyes anyway. Not long after, the phone on the table next to my bed started ringing loudly. I didn't want to answer, so I ignored it, but the ringing persisted. It rang over and over without stopping, showing no sign of letting up. Feeling around carefully so I wouldn't move my head too much, I found my phone and looked at the screen. It displayed Steve. Was he worried about me after all? I felt a bit relieved and answered the call.
Help me. The truth is, it's my parents.
Steve blurted this out and started talking without giving me a chance to speak.
After you were taken to the hospital yesterday, the police came by. I told them you just tripped because you got startled by the car. But today, they said someone came forward and testified that they saw Mom hit you.
Summarizing his excited rambling, it seemed both of his parents had been taken to the police station. I knew for a fact that I was hit by the car Natalie was driving yesterday. And yet, both Natalie and Robert, who had been in the passenger seat, had given false statements. And worse, it was Steve who told them to make it look like I had fallen by accident. I was so stunned that I couldn't speak for a while.
The car's fine, thankfully. It didn't even get a scratch. Dad's fine too, but Mom twisted her neck a little from the impact with you. But still, poor Mom. The police are treating her unfairly.
Steve didn't even notice my silence. He was too busy worrying about the car and his parents. How rotten can this family get? Had he said a single word of concern about me since I answered the phone? No, not one. Instead, he was asking me to prove his parents' innocence, even though I was the victim.
Hey, are you listening? You need to go explain to them in person that it was just a fall.
The number you dialed is currently unavailable. Steve had been talking nonstop, but he froze at the automated message that played after I hung up on him for the first time.
Huh?
I cut the call immediately. Even after that, Steve kept calling over and over, but I was so furious that I blocked his number. I found out later that, just as Steve had said, his parents were indeed taken to the police station. A while after that, Steve himself was also taken in to join his parents at the station. Julia, who lives across the street, witnessed everything. In fact, she was the one who reported Natalie's actions to the police in the first place. She had ridden with me in the ambulance and handled all the paperwork in Steve's place. Later, when the police arrived at the hospital, they asked her about the accident. By then, they had already spoken to Steve's parents, and Julia's statement supported what they had learned. Julia had noticed something was wrong because she'd heard a loud noise outside. When Julia looked out her window, she saw me lying in the street. She immediately called an ambulance and rushed outside. By the time she got there, Natalie's car was gone, and she had no idea what had happened. Instead of trying to figure out the cause, her main concern was whether I was okay. When the police questioned her, Julia told them everything as it was. However, my in-laws immediately denied the police's claim that I had been hit by a car. Julia found their reactions strange and kept thinking about it even after the police left. After staying at the hospital until my surgery was over, she went home and told Kevin about it. That's when Kevin came up with an unexpected solution.
The dash cam. It records 24/7. The scene happened right in front of the car. There's no way it didn't catch it.
Together, they checked the footage from the dash cam.
There it is.
Just as Kevin predicted, the exact moment of the accident was recorded. The video clearly showed Natalie hitting me with her car. After I collapsed, Robert stuck his head out of the passenger side window, but the car quickly drove away. It was a textbook case of a hit and run. With the damning footage in hand, they went to the police station. Thanks to their efforts, it was proven that I hadn't simply fallen and gotten injured. The police immediately began questioning my in-laws again, armed with the video evidence. Despite the clear footage, my in-laws stubbornly refused to admit their guilt.
That video is a setup. Someone's trying to frame me. Officer, please. You're really gonna put an old lady like me in jail.
Both Natalie and Robert were embarrassingly desperate to deny their crime. In the end, Natalie broke down and confessed, saying, "My son told me to cover it up." Steve really had instructed his parents to lie and stick to the same story. But for Natalie to throw her own son under the bus to save herself, it made me question her sanity. Robert, likely worn down by the interrogation, also admitted that he had been in the passenger seat and abandoned me as they fled the scene. With their confessions, the police turned their attention to Steve. Even then, Steve refused to admit his involvement. That's when a detective came to my hospital room.
Both of your in-laws stated that your husband told them to cover up the accident. They lied at first, but this part seems to be the truth.
The detective spoke with an apologetic tone, as if he felt sorry for me. The investigation into the car revealed no major scratches or dents. If Steve had tried to have the car repaired to hide the damage, it would have added to his charges for destroying evidence. But it seemed Steve had calmly decided that wasn't necessary. Since that day, Steve hadn't shown his face at all. I mentioned to the detective that Steve had called me when my in-laws were being questioned. I also told him that Steve admitted during the call that he instructed his parents to lie. Hearing that, the detective let out a deep sigh.
I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through.
Perhaps he sympathized with me, having not only been injured badly enough to require surgery, but also betrayed by my own family. A heavy silence hung in the air for a while. The detective politely took his leave, stood up, and quietly left my hospital room. A few days later, I was contacted by the police again on the day of my discharge. Julia came to pick me up from the hospital in her car, and we headed straight to the police station. When we arrived, the same detective who had previously spoken to me greeted us. It seemed the detective who had spoken with Julia was the same person. I was escorted inside by him, along with Julia. He led us into a room, where Steve and my in-laws sat looking haggard.
Emily.
Natalie's eyes welled up with tears as soon as she saw me enter the room. I thought she was faking it, but she seemed genuinely emotional. Maybe she was relieved to see a family member, or just felt reassured that seeing me alive might lighten her sentence. We were seated and waited for Natalie to calm down. A female officer soothed Natalie until she was able to speak. Next to her, Robert sat, exhausted, repeatedly mumbling, "I'm sorry." The purpose of the meeting that day was to go over the events of the accident with me, the victim, present. The detective projected the dashcam footage Julia had submitted onto a screen. As we watched, the detective explained everything step by step. My in-laws answered truthfully, and I nodded to confirm their statements. The main issue was whether Steve was involved. After I spoke with the police last time, they confirmed from Steve's phone records that he had called me. However, Steve still insisted he had no memory of telling his parents to lie. I hadn't recorded the conversation, so the discussion had a wall.
You're trying to take me down too, aren't you? You liar?
Despite the detective's efforts to calm him down, Steve grew agitated and emotional. "Please stop. The more lies you tell, the worse it'll be for you. Do you really want to betray Natalie and Robert just to save yourself?" Steve ignored my warning entirely. Sensing things weren't going anywhere, the detective spoke up.
So, are you saying that your parents have been lying to the police this whole time?
Steve's mouth clamped shut at those words. Coming from the detective, they carried far more weight than when I said them.
The footage clearly shows your mother hitting your wife with a car. Both of your parents have admitted to it. However, according to your story, your parents are now implicating you as a co-conspirator to reduce their own sentence.
Steve's face tightened at the detective's serious tone.
Do you understand what I'm saying? Your parents' charges could become even more severe.
At that, Steve finally confessed to his role. In the end, he realized the gravity of what he had done. With Steve's confession, the full extent of their crimes was revealed. The officers waiting outside the room began to move quickly.
And now,
The detective turned to me. The matter at hand was whether I wanted to withdraw my formal complaint. Although their crimes couldn't be erased, the course of their fate would change significantly depending on my decision. However, I firmly refused. I may have survived, but running away immediately after the accident is unforgivable. I'm filing a formal complaint to ensure they pay for their crime. My decision visibly shook the three of them. Natalie burst into tears, and both Robert and Steve hung their heads. They never thought I would make such a harsh decision. Each of them was convinced they were a good husband, a good mother-in-law, and a good father-in-law. They believed that I would, of course, forgive them. If they had handled the aftermath of the accident properly, I wouldn't have gone this far. But my in-laws chose to abandon me to protect themselves. Steve, too, prioritized his parents and his reputation over his wife's life. I wanted them to reflect on the gravity of their actions and atone for their sins. I silently stood up and left the room. Julia stayed by my side as I began the necessary paperwork in another room. I had lived with my in-laws and my husband for many years. If you asked me whether it pained me to do this, I would be lying if I said it didn't. But above all, I was the one who had been hurt the most. Even if my physical wounds healed, this trauma would follow me for the rest of my life. Even though I had done nothing wrong, I still couldn't shake off the heavy feeling inside me. By the time we left the police station, the sun had set completely. Julia, being thoughtful, suggested we have a celebratory dinner for my discharge. Grateful for her kindness, I went to Julia and Kevin's house. They welcomed me warmly, and we enjoyed dinner together. For the first time in a long while, I laughed. Even though they were mindful of my feelings, they treated me the same as always. Even though my in-laws and Steve were no longer in my life, from now on, I was on my own. There were still court proceedings and other matters that needed to be handled. Just thinking about it all made me feel overwhelmed. But that night, I let myself forget everything and had a wonderful time. The morning after that pleasant night, I made up my mind to divorce Steve. There was no reason to keep punishing myself. Steve may have learned his lesson from this ordeal, but I realized I could never love him again. I immediately signed the divorce papers and handed them to Steve. At first, Steve seemed surprised when he saw the papers, but he quickly accepted them with resignation. Unable to bear seeing him look so pitiful, I left the rest of the arrangements to my lawyer. The three of them were sentenced to criminal charges, and on top of that, they had to pay me compensation. Since Steve was at fault for the divorce, I received an even larger settlement. I decided to leave my in-laws' house and used the compensation to rent an apartment. Although I had initially planned to move to a new city and start over, I chose to stay in my familiar hometown. There was a reason I didn't move far away. It turns out that Julia's husband, Kevin, ran a business. He had invited me to help out at his company. Julia was also helping with the business, and I thought I'd give it a try too. She had invited me a few times before, but I'd always turned it down because I was afraid of what my in-laws or Steve would say. To be honest, with the settlement money I received, I didn't really need to work. But Julia and Kevin were genuinely concerned about my well-being. They gave me a sense of purpose when I suddenly found myself alone. After spending decades as a housewife, working alongside friends was an entirely new and exciting experience. I was often bewildered by how unfamiliar everything was, but it became a significant source of fulfillment for me. As I embraced this new chapter in my life, fate had another surprise in store for me. Through work, I met a man, and we ended up getting remarried. I had told him about my divorce, but kept the settlement money a secret until we got married. Even then, he didn't hold it against me. "You went through so much pain. It's only natural to be cautious," he said with a smile. My life took a drastic turn after I passed the halfway point of my years. I felt that I was more fulfilled and happier now than I had ever been in my youth. Although I had been betrayed and hurt by someone I trusted for so long, I found a happiness that far outweighed that pain. Grateful to the friends who had always extended a helping hand, I took my first steps toward a brighter future.